In the winter of 1923, when the Kansas plains stretched endless beneath a sky the color of old pewter, a Chicago-bound freight train carried more than grain and livestock through the frozen darkness. Hidden between the cattle cars, a 17-year-old girl named Clara Whitmore clutched her swollen belly and counted the miles between her shame and whatever mercy might wait at the end of the line. She had paid a conductor's assistant $3 and her mother's wedding ring for passage east, believing distance might wash clean what whispers and pointing fingers had made unbearable. But mercy, she would learn, does not always arrive as expected. Sometimes it comes wrapped in violence, delivered through pain, and found only after everything familiar has been stripped away. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Whitmore farm, squatted against the Nebraska horizon like a wound that refused to heal. 23 acres of stubborn earth that yielded just enough corn to keep the family from starving, but never enough to prosper. The house leaned eastward, weathered gray by decades of prairie wind, its porch sagging under the weight of too many harsh winters and broken promises. Clara had been born in the back bedroom during a blizzard, her first cry mixing with the howl of wind through gaps in the siding. Now 17 years later, she stood at that same window watching her father, Henry Whitmore, drag himself across the yard toward the barn. His shoulders curved inward like a man carrying stones, his gait uneven from the leg that never healed. Right after the horse kicked him 3 summers back, the pregnancy showed now, unmistakable beneath her worn calico dress. 5 months along, though she'd hidden it for 3. Her mother, Ruth, had stopped speaking to her entirely after the truth came out, communicating only through pointed silences and meals left on the table without ceremony. The Reverend had been more direct. He'd stood on their porch 2 weeks ago, black hat in hand, and suggested Clara might find peace elsewhere before the congregation lost its Christian charity. Clara pressed her palm against the window glass, feeling the December cold seep through. The baby moved inside her, a flutter like bird wings against her ribs. She'd grown accustomed to these moments when the child reminded her of its presence, though she still couldn't decide if the feeling brought comfort or dread. Her father's voice carried across the yard, rough and tired. He was talking to the cow again, the way he'd taken to doing since the isolation had settled over them like dust. The neighbors had stopped visiting. Mrs. Henderson no longer brought preserves when she came to town. Even old Tom Garrity, who'd helped with harvest for as long as Clara could remember, had found reasons to be elsewhere when the work needed doing. The sound of her mother's footsteps on the kitchen floorboards drew Clara away from the window. Ruth Whitmore moved through her daily routines with mechanical precision, as if keeping busy might somehow undo what had already been done. She kneaded bread with more force than necessary, scrubbed floors that weren't dirty, and mended clothes that barely needed stitching. Clara descended the stairs carefully, one hand on the banister, the other supporting her belly. The kitchen held the lingering scent of bacon from breakfast, though she'd been too nauseated to eat. Her mother stood at the stove, stirring oatmeal that had long since finished cooking. "Mama," Clara said quietly. Ruth didn't turn around. The wooden spoon scraped against the bottom of the pot in steady, mindless circles. Clara tried again. "The baby's moving more now. I thought you might want to—" "Don't." Ruth's voice was flat, worn smooth by repetition. "Don't bring that shame into my kitchen." Clara's hand instinctively moved to her belly, protective. "It's still your grandchild." Ruth finally turned, her face carved from the same unforgiving stone as the prairie itself. "A grandchild has a father with a name and a ring on its mother's finger. What you're carrying is consequence." The words landed with the weight of judgment, but Clara no longer flinched from them. She'd heard variations of the same sentiment whispered at church, muttered in the general store. spoken aloud by neighbors who thought she couldn't hear. The father, Jimmy Morrison, the banker's son, had denied everything when confronted. He'd looked her straight in the eye during the harvest festival and called her a liar, his voice carrying just the right note of wounded innocence to convince anyone who wanted to believe him. Clara poured herself a cup of water from the pitcher, her movements deliberate and steady. "I'll be gone soon enough." "Where?" Ruth asked, though her tone suggested she didn't much care about the answer. "Chicago. Mrs. Patterson says her cousin might have work for a girl willing to clean houses." Ruth returned to her stirring. "Chicago won't want you any more than we do." Clara finished her water and set the cup in the wash basin. She'd stopped trying to argue with her mother's cruelty. The woman who had once sung lullabies and braided her hair had disappeared the night Clara confessed her condition, replaced by this bitter stranger who counted Clara's presence as a daily humiliation. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows in their frames. Clara wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and walked to the front room, where her father kept his newspapers. 3 months old, most of them, brought home from his infrequent trips to town. She read them carefully, searching for any mention of opportunities in the cities, any suggestion that the world beyond the farm might hold possibilities instead of just different forms of rejection. An advertisement caught her attention. Domestic help wanted. Respectable young women, of good character. Inquire at Brennan House, Chicago, Illinois. The words blurred as she read them again, hope and desperation tangling in her chest like thorned vines. Henry Whitmore stamped his boots on the porch before entering, bringing the smell of hay and cold air with him. He glanced at Clara, then at his wife, reading the tension that hung between them like smoke from a damp fire. "Roads are getting bad," he said to no one in particular. "Won't be able to get to town much longer if this weather keeps up." Clara folded the newspaper carefully, creasing it along the lines of the advertisement. "I need to get to the train station." Her father removed his coat slowly, each movement deliberate. "What for?" "I'm leaving." She stood, her hand pressed to the small of her back, where an ache had been growing stronger each day. "Tomorrow, if I can manage it." Henry looked at his wife, who had gone still at the stove. "Ruth, let her go," Ruth said without turning around. "She's made her choices." Clara felt the words like a slap, but she kept her expression steady. She'd learned to absorb her mother's punishment without showing the damage it caused. "I have money saved, enough for a ticket east," her father nodded slowly. He'd aged 10 years in the month since Clara's condition became known. His hair gone completely grey, new lines mapping the territory around his eyes. "Train comes through Millfield at dawn. I can take you that far." "Henry," Ruth started. "I can take her," he repeated, his voice carrying a finality that discouraged argument. That evening, Clara packed her few belongings into a canvas bag her grandmother had used for traveling. 2 dresses, both let out as much as the fabric would allow. A pair of boots with new soles. Her mother's Bible, taken not from faith but from need. The hollow space behind the binding held the $23 she'd saved from selling eggs and doing mending for neighbors who still spoke to her. She stood in her bedroom doorway one last time, memorizing details she knew she'd forget. The way moonlight fell across the floorboards, the sound of mice in the walls, the faint scent of lavender her mother had once sewn into sachets for the dresser drawers. This room had contained her entire world for 17 years. Tomorrow it would be empty, and she would be just another girl with no name on a train, heading toward a future she couldn't imagine. Ruth appeared in the hallway, her face pale in the lamplight. For a moment, Clara thought her mother might soften, might offer some word of blessing or forgiveness. Instead, Ruth handed her a small bundle wrapped in brown paper. "Cornbread," she said curtly, "for the journey." Clara accepted the package, feeling its warmth through the wrapping. "Thank you." Ruth nodded once and disappeared back into the shadows of the hallway, leaving Clara alone with the weight of all the words they would never speak to each other. The night passed slowly, marked by the settling of old wood and the distant cry of coyotes hunting across the frozen fields. Clara lay in her narrow bed, one hand on her belly, feeling the baby's restless movements. At some point during the long hours before dawn, she realized she was no longer afraid of leaving. What terrified her now was the possibility that everywhere she went would feel exactly like here. Unwelcome, judged, impossibly alone. When her father called her name just before sunrise, she was already dressed and waiting. Henry Whitmore stood in the kitchen doorway, his coat buttoned against the cold, holding the lantern that would light their way to the wagon. "Ready?" he asked. Clara shouldered her bag and followed him into the bitter morning air. Ruth stood at the kitchen window, a silhouette framed by lamplight, but she didn't raise her hand in farewell. Clara looked back once as the wagon pulled away from the house, watching the small rectangle of yellow light grow smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely into the grey dawn. The ride to Millfield took 2 hours over roads rutted with frozen mud and patches of ice that made the wagon slip and slide, despite her father's careful handling of the reins. They spoke little, both understanding that words wouldn't change what was happening or make it easier to bear. At the station, a small wooden building that served 3 counties, Henry helped Clara down from the wagon and walked with her to the platform. The Chicago-bound freight had passenger cars attached twice a week, though it wasn't a comfortable way to travel. Clara had her ticket, purchased with money earned from work her mother now pretended had never happened. "You write when you can," Henry said, his voice rough with cold and something else he wouldn't name. "I will." He pressed a folded bill into her hand. "For whatever you need." Clara looked down at the $5, more money than her father had possessed at one time in months. "Papa, you can't spare this." "I can't spare you either," he said quietly. "But here we are." The train's whistle echoed across the prairie, a lonely sound that seemed to carry all the world's sadness in its call. Clara kissed her father's weathered cheek and boarded the car, finding a seat by the window where she could watch him until distance made him disappear. As the train pulled away from Millfield, carrying her toward whatever waited in Chicago, Clara pressed her face to the glass and watched the only world she'd ever known roll away beneath wheels that sang against steel rails. The baby kicked, strong and insistent, and for the first time since she'd felt that first flutter of movement, Clara allowed herself to whisper words she'd been afraid to speak aloud. "We're going to be all right," she said, her breath fogging the window. Somehow, we're going to be all right, but Mercy, as she would soon learn, had its own plans for Clara Whitmore and the child she carried. And those plans would unfold not in the safety of Chicago's anonymous streets, but in the brutal cold of a Kansas winter night, when the train carrying her toward hope would become the instrument of her greatest trial. The train swayed through the afternoon like a great iron beast drinking distance, its rhythm both lulling and relentless. Clara had claimed a window seat in the third passenger car, her canvas bag tucked beneath her feet, one hand resting protectively on her belly. The countryside rolled past in shades of winter brown. Dormant fields, bare trees, farmhouses that looked like scattered dice thrown across the prairie. She'd eaten half the cornbread her mother had given her, saving the rest for later, though. Her stomach cramped with hunger. The baby seemed restless today, shifting and pressing against her ribs in ways that made breathing difficult. Other passengers came and went at small depot stops, most of the men traveling alone. A few families with children who stared at Clara's condition with the frank curiosity of the young. An elderly woman in a worn black coat had boarded at Hutchinson and taken the seat across the aisle. She'd nodded politely to Clara, then settled into her knitting, with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to long journeys. The click of her needles provided a counterpoint to the train's steady rhythm, oddly comforting in its persistence. The day wore on. Clara noticed 3 men who seemed different from the other passengers. They'd boarded together at Wichita, taking seats near the front of the car, their conversation too quiet to overhear, but their occasional glances in her direction unmistakable. The tallest one, with sandy hair and clothes that suggested money, kept turning to look at her with an expression she couldn't read. The conductor, a thin man with a graying moustache, made his rounds, collecting tickets and checking his pocket watch. When he reached Clara's seat, he studied her ticket with particular attention. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Chicago?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of surprise. "Yes, sir." He looked at her belly, then at her face, his expression shifting to something that might have been concern or disapproval. "Traveling alone?" "Yes, sir." The conductor glanced toward the 3 men at the front of the car, then back at Clara. "You be careful, miss. Not everyone on these trains has Christian intentions." Clara nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure what he meant. The warning settled uneasily in her stomach alongside the cornbread and the constant low-grade nausea that had become her companion. Evening approached with the peculiar suddenness of winter, the sky deepening from pale grey to charcoal. The train made a water stop at a small depot whose name Clara couldn't see in the gathering darkness. Most of the passengers remained in their seats, but the 3 men from the front of the car stepped outside to smoke. Through the window, Clara watched them standing on the platform, their cigarettes glowing like fireflies in the dusk. They spoke in low voices, heads bent together in the manner of men sharing secrets. The tall one gestured toward the train, toward Clara's car specifically, and something in the movement made her pulse quicken. When they reboarded, they didn't return to their original seats. Instead, they spread out through the car, one taking a seat directly behind Clara, another across the aisle and 2 rows up, the third settling near the rear exit. The positioning felt deliberate, though Clara told herself she was imagining threats where none existed. The elderly woman with the knitting had dozed off, her needles still in her lap, head tilted against the window. Most of the other passengers appeared to be sleeping as well, lulled by the train's hypnotic motion and the day's-long journey. Clara tried to follow their example, closing her eyes and leaning back in her seat, but sleep wouldn't come. The man behind her shifted in his seat, the sound of fabric against leather unmistakable in the quiet car. Clara kept her breathing steady, feigning sleep while her ears strained for any sound that might indicate danger. Her father had taught her to trust her instincts about people, and every instinct she possessed was now screaming warnings. The train began to slow as it approached another depot, this one larger than the previous stops. Clara could see lights. In the distance, the glow of a town that might offer safety if she needed it. She made a decision, gathering her bag as quietly as possible and preparing to disembark. But as she started to rise from her seat, the man behind her leaned forward. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," he said quietly, his voice carrying a casual menace that froze her in place. Clara turned to face him, her heart hammering against her ribs. He was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 25, with pale eyes and a smile that didn't reach them. "I'm sorry," she managed. Sitting back down would be the smart thing to do. His hand rested on the back of her seat now, close enough to her shoulder that she could feel the heat from his skin. "We need to have a conversation, you and us." The train shuddered to a stop at the depot. Clara could hear voices on the platform, the normal sounds of passengers boarding and departing. Safety was just a few yards away, but it might as well have been miles. "I don't know what you want," Clara said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Sure you do." The tall man from the front of the car had moved closer, settling into the seat beside the sleeping woman. "Jimmy Morrison sends his regards." The name hit Clara like a physical blow. Jimmy Morrison, the banker's son who had denied everything, who had looked her in the eye and called her a liar. Somehow he had reached across the distance to find her here. "I don't know any Jimmy Morrison," Clara said automatically, the lie sliding out before she could stop it. The pale-eyed man behind her laughed softly. "Now that's interesting, because Jimmy knows you real well, knows you well enough to be concerned about the stories you might tell in Chicago." Clara's mind raced. How had Morrison known she was leaving? Who had told him about her destination? The answer came with sickening clarity. Mrs. Patterson, who had promised to write to her cousin about domestic work. Mrs. Patterson, whose husband did business with the Morrison Bank. "I'm not telling any stories," Clara said. "I just want to be left alone." "That's good," the tall man said. "That's real good. Because Jimmy thinks it might be better for everyone if those stories stayed buried." The train lurched back into motion, pulling away from the depot and the safety Clara had briefly imagined within her reach. The elderly woman stirred in her. Sleep but didn't wake. The conductor had disappeared into the forward cars, leaving Clara alone with her captors. "What do you want?" she asked. The pale-eyed man leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. "Jimmy's got a reputation to protect, family name to consider. Can't have bastard children showing up to complicate things." "The baby isn't his," Clara lied again, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "Maybe not," the tall man said, "but you telling folks it could cause all kinds of trouble. Better for everyone if that problem just went away." Clara's hand moved instinctively to her belly, protective. "You can't..." "Can't what?" The third man, who had been silent until now, spoke from his position near the rear of the car. His voice was harder than the others, carrying the weight of someone accustomed to violence. "We can't do whatever needs doing." The train was picking up speed now, swaying as it took a curve through open countryside. Outside, the darkness was complete, broken only by the occasional farmhouse light flickering past like a fallen star. "Here's what's going to happen," the pale-eyed man said, his voice conversational despite the threat it carried. "You're going to stand up nice and quiet, and we're going to take a walk to the space between the cars. Fresh air will do you good." Clara shook her head. "No." It wasn't a request. The man behind her gripped her shoulder, his fingers digging into the fabric of her coat. Clara tried to pull away, but his hold was firm. The baby kicked frantically inside her, as if sensing the danger. "Please," Clara whispered. "I'll leave. I'll go somewhere else. I won't cause any trouble." "Too late for that," the tall man said. "Should have thought about the consequences before you opened your legs." The crude words hit Clara like a slap. She thought of her mother's similar condemnation, her father's resigned acceptance, the reverend suggestion that she find peace elsewhere. Everyone had judged her, condemned her, wished her gone. Now these men were here to make that wish reality. "Stand up," the pale-eyed man said again, his grip tightening. Clara had no choice. She rose from her seat, her bag clutched against her chest like armor. The man behind her guided her toward the rear of the car, past sleeping passengers who might as well have been corpses for all the help they could provide. The space between the cars was brutally cold, the wind whipping through the gap with enough force to steal breath. Clara stumbled as the train swayed, catching herself against the metal railing. Below, the ground rushed past in a blur of darkness and speed. "Jimmy wanted us to give you a message," the tall man said, having to raise his voice above the wind and the clatter of wheels on rails. "I told you I don't know him," Clara said desperately. "Stop lying." The third man, the violent one, stepped closer. "We know who you are. We know what you did. And we know what happens to girls who don't know when to keep their mouths shut." Clara pressed herself against the side of the car, her free hand gripping the railing. The train was traveling fast now, faster than it had during the day. Trees and telegraph poles flashed past in the darkness like ghostly sentinels. "Jimmy Morrison is going to marry the Fletcher girl come spring," the pale-eyed man continued. "Big wedding, important families, can't have any complications, showing up to spoil things." "I won't say anything," Clara pleaded. "I swear I'll never mention his name." "That's right," the violent man said. "You won't." He moved toward her, and Clara saw the intent in his eyes. She pressed harder against the railing, feeling the metal bite into her back through her coat. Below, the ground rushed past in a deadly blur. "Please," she whispered. The baby's the problem," the tall man said. "Jimmy's problem, and now it's going to stop being a problem." Clara closed her eyes and thought of her father's weathered hands, her mother's bitter silence, the small kindnesses she'd known in her 17 years. She thought of the child moving inside her, innocent of the circumstances of its creation, deserving of life regardless of the failures of its parents. When the violent man reached for her, Clara did the only thing she could do. She fought. She swung her canvas bag with all the strength she possessed, catching him across the face. He cursed and staggered backward, blood streaming from his nose. The pale-eyed man lunged forward to grab her, but Clara twisted away, her pregnant belly making her clumsy, but her desperation making her quick. The struggle lasted only seconds. Clara felt hands on her coat, her arms, her hair. She clawed and bit and screamed, but the sound was lost in the wind and the thunder of the train. The baby kicked frantically inside her, and she wondered if it could sense what was about to happen. The railing struck her in the back, hard enough to drive the breath from her lungs. She felt herself tipping, falling, the train's rhythm suddenly absent as the ground rushed up to meet her. The impact when she hit was immediate and complete, pain exploding through every nerve in her body. She rolled, tumbled, felt rocks and frozen earth tearing at her clothes and skin. The train's lights disappeared into the distance, carrying her attackers away from the consequences of their actions. Clara lay in the snow beside the railroad tracks, her body broken and bleeding, her baby still moving weakly inside her wounded belly. Above, stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human suffering. The cold bit through her torn coat, through her skin, settling into her bones like judgment. She tried to call for help, but her voice was little more than a whisper lost in the vast emptiness of the Kansas night. No houses showed lights nearby. No other trains would pass until morning, if then. She was alone with her pain and her fear and the child that might not survive what had been done to them both. Blood soaked through her dress, dark against the snow. Clara pressed her hands to her belly, feeling the baby's movements grow weaker, more sporadic. She had wanted to protect this child, to give it the chances she'd never had. Instead, she had brought it to this, broken and dying beside railroad tracks in the middle of nowhere. The cold was winning now, creeping through her torn clothes and damaged flesh. Clara's vision blurred, darkness creeping in from the edges. She thought she heard something, footsteps in the snow, a voice calling, but it might have been the wind playing tricks on her failing senses. As consciousness slipped away, Clara whispered words meant for the child she might never see born, promises she might never be able to keep. The stars above offered no comfort, no hope, only the cold light of distant suns that had seen countless tragedies and would see countless more. But mercy, Clara would learn when she woke, sometimes arrived wearing boots caked with mud and smelling of horses, carried by hands that knew how to heal and a voice that spoke her name like a prayer answered. Thomas Brennan had been checking the south fence line when he heard what sounded like thunder in a cloudless sky. The sound came from the direction of the railroad tracks, too distant to identify but wrong enough to make him straighten in his saddle. His horse, a bay mare named Duchess, snorted and shifted beneath him, ears pricked toward the sound. The Brennan Ranch sprawled across 8,000 acres of Kansas prairie, cattle land that had supported 3 generations of his family. Thomas, at 24, had inherited both the responsibility and the isolation that came with managing such a vast property. His father had died 2 years earlier in a riding accident, leaving Thomas to run the operation with only seasonal help and his own determination. He'd been riding fence since dawn, checking for breaks in the wire after the previous week's ice storm. The work was solitary and methodical, the kind of task that let his mind wander while his hands stayed busy. He'd been thinking about the letter from his aunt in Topeka, another attempt to convince him to find a wife and settle down properly. When the strange sound interrupted his thoughts, Thomas urged Duchess toward the railroad tracks, following a cattle trail that wound through a grove of bare cottonwoods. The tracks ran along the northern edge of his property, a steel ribbon that connected his isolated world to cities he'd never seen. Freight trains passed regularly, carrying grain and cattle to markets back east, but passenger service was irregular at best. The snow lay deeper here in the shelter of the trees, unmarked except for the delicate tracks of rabbits and the larger prints of deer. Thomas had almost decided he'd imagined the sound when Duchess suddenly stopped, her head raised, nostrils flaring. "What is it, girl?" he murmured, scanning the area ahead. Then he saw the dark shape beside the tracks, partially hidden by a snowdrift. At first glance, it looked like a bundle of discarded clothes, but something about the way it lay sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the winter air. Thomas dismounted and approached cautiously, leading Duchess by the reins. As he got closer, the bundle resolved into human form. A young woman lying motionless in the snow, her dark coat torn and stained with blood. Her face was pale as winter sky, lips tinged blue with cold. "Jesus!" Thomas breathed, dropping to his knees beside her. She was alive, barely. Her breathing was so shallow he had to put his ear close to her mouth to detect it. Blood had soaked through her dress and into the snow beneath her, dark stains that told of serious injury. But it was the curve of her belly that stopped Thomas. Cold. This wasn't just a woman thrown from a train. This was a woman with a child, and both lives were hung by threads as thin as spider silk. Thomas had seen enough accidents on the ranch to recognize the signs of internal bleeding. The woman's skin had the waxy pallor that came with significant blood loss, and her pulse, when he found it at her throat, was rapid and thready. He had minutes, maybe less, to get her somewhere warm and safe. Moving her was dangerous, internal. Injuries could be worsened by transport, but leaving her here meant certain death from exposure. Thomas made his decision with the swift calculation that came from years of making choices where every option carried risk. He shrugged out of his heavy coat and wrapped it around the unconscious woman, then lifted her as gently as possible. She was heavier than he'd expected, the weight of pregnancy adding to her slight frame. Duchess stood steady as he managed to get the woman across the saddle, positioning himself behind her to hold her secure during the ride back to the ranch house. The journey that normally took 20 minutes stretched into an eternity. Thomas held the woman against his chest, feeling the weak flutter of her pulse, the barely perceptible rise and fall of her breathing. Several times she stirred, making soft sounds that might have been words or simply expressions of pain. He spoke to her in low, steady tones, the way he would to a wounded animal, offering comfort even though she couldn't hear him. "Hold on," he murmured. "Just hold on. We're almost there." The ranch house came into view just as the woman's breathing became so shallow, Thomas feared she might slip away before he could get her inside. The two-story structure sat in a grove of oak trees, solid and welcoming, with smoke rising from a chimney. Thomas had never been so grateful to see home. He carried her through the front door and up the stairs to the guest bedroom, a space that had remained unused since his aunt's last visit 2 years ago. The room was cold but clean, furnished with a brass bed and a washstand that his grandmother had brought from Missouri. Thomas settled the woman on the bed, then hurried to build a fire in the small grate. With warmth beginning to fill the room, Thomas could better assess the extent of the woman's injuries. Her coat and dress were torn in several places, revealing cuts and bruises that suggested she'd been dragged or had fallen from a great height. The blood seemed to be coming primarily from a gash on her head and several deep scrapes along her arms and legs. But it was the potential for internal injuries that worried him most. Thomas had learned basic medical care from necessity. The nearest doctor was in Hayes, 40 miles away, and ranch emergencies couldn't always wait for professional help. He cleaned her wounds as best he could, applying pressure to stop the bleeding, then covered her with every blanket he could find in the house. As he worked, Thomas found himself studying the woman's face. She was young, probably not much older than his youngest sister would have been, with delicate features that spoke of gentleness rather than hardship. Her hands, when he examined them for injuries, were soft but calloused in places that suggested familiarity with work. A farm girl, he guessed, though her clothes suggested family of some means. The most pressing concern was the baby. Thomas had helped deliver calves and foals, but human birth was beyond his experience. He could see the woman's belly moving with weak but persistent contractions, and he feared the trauma might have triggered premature labor. Throughout the night, Thomas maintained his vigil. He fed the fire, changed blooded bandages, and monitored the woman's breathing. Several times she seemed to hover on the edge of consciousness, her lips moving soundlessly, her hands moving protectively to her belly, even in her unconscious state. Near dawn, her eyes fluttered open for the first time. They were brown, Thomas noticed, the color of rich earth after rain. For a moment they held no recognition, no awareness of her surroundings. Then fear flickered in them, sharp and immediate. "Easy," Thomas said softly, staying seated in the chair beside the bed so as not to startle her. "You're safe. You're in my house." The woman tried to speak, but only a rasping whisper emerged. Thomas helped her take small sips of water from a cup he'd kept ready. The liquid seemed to restore some strength to her voice. "My baby," she managed. "Is my baby still moving?" Thomas assured her. "I can see the little one shifting around in there. Seems like a fighter." Relief flooded her features, followed immediately by renewed anxiety. "The men, are they—" "What men?" Thomas asked gently. The woman's eyes darted toward the window, then back to his face. She seemed to be weighing how much to tell him, measuring his trustworthiness against her fear. "I don't remember," she said finally, which Thomas suspected was a lie. "What's your name?" Another pause. "Clara," she said. "Clara Whitmore. I'm Thomas Brennan. This is my ranch. You're about 3 miles from the railroad tracks where I found you." Clara nodded slowly, as if processing this information required enormous effort. "How long have I been—" "Nearly 18 hours. You lost a fair amount of blood, but the bleeding stopped now." Head wound looked worse than it was. Clara's hand moved to her belly, and Thomas saw her wince as she tried to shift position. The movement seemed to trigger another contraction, her face tightening with pain. "The baby's coming early," Thomas said matter-of-factly. "Could be the trauma that brought it on, or maybe it was time anyway. Do you know how far along you are?" 7 months, Clara whispered. "Maybe 8. I wasn't sure." She broke off as another contraction gripped her, stronger this time. Thomas had seen enough difficult births among his livestock to recognize the signs. This baby was determined to be born, ready or not. "I need to get the doctor," Thomas said, rising from his chair. "No!" Clara's voice was sharp with panic. "No doctors, please!" Thomas frowned. "Clara, you need medical attention. Both of you do." "No," she repeated, her voice quieter but just as firm. "I can't. They might find me." There it was, confirmation that Clara was running from something or someone. Thomas sat back down, studying her face. Whatever had brought her to be on that train, whatever had led to her being thrown from it, she was more afraid of discovery than of death. "All right," he said finally. "No doctor, but you need to understand, I'm not qualified to deliver a baby. If something goes wrong, it won't," Clara said with more conviction than her situation warranted. "The baby's strong. I can feel it." Over the next several hours, Thomas found himself pressed into service as an unlikely midwife. Clara's labor progressed slowly but steadily, her body fighting to bring new life into the world despite its own trauma. Between contractions, she dozed fitfully, sometimes mumbling words Thomas couldn't understand. Thomas prepared as best he could, boiling water and gathering clean linens from his grandmother's hope chest. He'd assisted at difficult animal births before, but this felt entirely different, more sacred somehow, and infinitely more terrifying. As the day wore on, Clara grew stronger rather than weaker, as if the act of bringing her child into the world was restoring something essential to her spirit. During the quiet moments between contractions, she began to share fragments of her story: a farm in Nebraska, parents who disowned her, a desperate journey toward an uncertain future. She didn't mention the men who had thrown her from the train, and Thomas didn't press. Some truths revealed themselves in their own time, and Clara had endured enough interrogation for one lifetime. Late in the afternoon, as snow began to fall again outside the bedroom window, Clara's labor reached its final stage. Thomas found himself holding her hand, offering what comfort he could as she fought to bring her child safely into the world. "I can see the head," Thomas said, his voice tight with concentration and awe. "Just a little more, Clara. You're doing fine." Clara bore down with the last of her strength, her face flushed with effort. Thomas had witnessed countless births among his animals, but nothing had prepared him for the miracle of a human child entering the world, tiny, perfect and impossibly alive. The baby was small but healthy, its cries filling the room with a sound that seemed to banish all the darkness that had brought Clara to this place. Thomas cleaned the infant with trembling hands, then wrapped it in one of his grandmother's quilts before placing it in Clara's arms. "A girl," he said softly. "She's beautiful, Clara." Clara looked down at her daughter with an expression Thomas had never seen on another person's face: complete, transformative love mixed with fierce, protective determination. The baby quieted at her mother's touch, dark eyes opening to study this new world she'd fought so hard to enter. "Hello, little one," Clara whispered. "I'm sorry it took so long to meet you properly." Thomas busied himself cleaning up, giving mother and child privacy for their first moments together. Through the window, he could see the snow falling more, heavily now, covering the tracks Clara had left, erasing the evidence of how she'd come to be here. When Clara finally looked up at him, her face was transformed. The fear and desperation he'd seen earlier had been replaced by something softer, but no less powerful. Gratitude, perhaps, or simply the relief of having survived what had seemed impossible. "Thank you," she said. "I don't know how to—" "No need," Thomas interrupted. "Anyone would have done the same." But even as he spoke the words, Thomas knew they weren't entirely true. Not everyone would have taken in a stranger, delivered her, baby, and asked no questions about the circumstances that had brought her to his doorstep. He'd acted not from obligation, but from something deeper, a recognition of another soul in need of sanctuary. Over the next several days, as Clara recovered, her strength and the baby thrived, Thomas found his carefully ordered life reshaping itself around these unexpected guests. He moved his own belongings to the small room off the kitchen, giving Clara and the baby privacy and comfort. He learned to prepare meals that would help Clara regain her strength, to stoke fires that would keep the baby warm, to speak in the hushed tones that new life seemed to require. Clara, for her part, adapted to her new circumstances with a resilience that impressed Thomas. She was clearly accustomed to hardship and to making the best of difficult situations. She never complained about her injuries, which were healing slowly but steadily, or about the isolation of the ranch. Instead, she seemed to find peace in the quiet rhythms of recovery. She named the baby Rose, after her grandmother. "She was the only person who ever told me I was brave," Clara explained, cradling her daughter near the bedroom window, where afternoon light painted them both gold. Thomas began to look forward to these quiet conversations, to the sound of Clara's voice in his house, to the sight of her moving carefully but confidently through rooms that had been empty for too long. She asked for little and offered much, helping with small tasks as her strength returned, cooking meals that were better than anything Thomas had managed alone, bringing a warmth to the house that had nothing to do with the fires in the grates. But underneath the growing comfort of their shared days, questions remained unspoken. Clara never mentioned returning to Nebraska or continuing on to Chicago. She never talked about the baby's father or the men who had tried to silence her permanently. And Thomas, recognizing her need for sanctuary, didn't ask. Instead, they built a routine that felt both temporary and eternal, Thomas tending his cattle and fences during the day, returning in the evening to find Clara reading by the fire or singing softly to Rose. They shared meals and conversation, the careful politeness of strangers gradually giving way to something more natural and easy. One evening, as Thomas sat whittling by the fire while Clara mended one of his shirts, she spoke without looking up from her work. "I was supposed to be in Chicago by now." Thomas didn't reply immediately, sensing that Clara needed to tell this story at her own pace. "I had plans," she continued. "Work arranged, a place to live. I thought if I could just get far enough away, everything would be different." "Things have a way of working out," Thomas said carefully, "just not always the way we expect." Clara looked at him then, really looked, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. "You saved my life, both our lives. I don't know how I'll ever—" "You don't owe me anything," Thomas said firmly. "You and Rose are welcome here as long as you want to stay." Something shifted in Clara's expression, a wall coming down or a door opening. Thomas couldn't be sure which, but he felt the change like warmth from an unexpected fire. "What if I wanted to stay?" she asked quietly. "What if Chicago doesn't seem as important as it did before?" Thomas set down his whittling and looked at her fully. Clara was no longer the broken woman he'd found in the snow. Her strength had returned, along with something else. Hope, perhaps, or simply the recognition that sanctuary, once found, didn't have to be temporary. "Then you stay," he said simply, "for as long as you want." Outside, the wind moved through the oak trees, carrying the scent of snow and the promise of spring still months away. Inside, the fire crackled softly, and baby Rose slept peacefully in her makeshift cradle. Clara and Thomas sat in comfortable silence, two people who had found in each other something they hadn't known they were looking for. Not love, not yet, but the possibility of it. The foundation upon which love might grow, given time and care and the courage to trust in tomorrow. February came to the Kansas prairie with a vengeance that made January seem gentle by comparison. The wind carried ice crystals sharp enough to cut skin, and the cold settled into the bones of every living thing with the permanence of judgment. Thomas had seen harsh winters before, but this one tested even his prairie-bred endurance. Inside the ranch house, Clara moved through her days with quiet efficiency, baby Rose tucked against her shoulder or sleeping in the wooden cradle Thomas had fashioned from oak planks. The infant thrived despite her early arrival, growing stronger each day with the determined resilience she'd inherited from her mother. Clara nursed her by the fireplace while Thomas worked at the kitchen table, updating his ranch records and planning for spring calving season. Their conversations had settled into comfortable patterns, discussions of practical matters like supplies needed from town, observations about the weather, gentle questions about Rose's development. But underneath the domestic tranquility, Thomas sensed currents of unspoken tension. Clara's sleep remained restless, marked by soft cries that she muffled into her pillow. Sometimes he would find her standing at the window in the early morning, hours, staring out at the empty landscape, as if expecting to see something that never appeared. The isolation that winter brought seemed to press more heavily on Clara than the physical hardships. Thomas was accustomed to weeks passing without seeing another soul, but Clara had come from a world where neighbors lived within walking distance and human voices were part of the daily texture of life. The ranch's vast silence, broken only by wind and the occasional lowing of cattle, seemed to echo with memories she couldn't escape. It was during the third week of February that the first crack in Clara's carefully maintained composure became visible. Thomas had been out since before dawn, breaking ice on the stock tanks and checking on the cattle huddled in the shelter of the south pasture. The work was brutal in the sub-zero temperatures, requiring frequent returns to the barn to warm his hands enough to maintain feeling in his fingers. When he finally returned to the house near midday, he found Clara sitting at the kitchen table with Rose in her arms, both of them crying. Not the soft weeping he'd occasionally heard through her bedroom door, but deep, wrenching sobs that shook Clara's slight frame. Thomas stopped in the doorway, uncertain whether to intrude or retreat. Clara looked up at him with eyes red-rimmed, and desperate, her usual composure completely shattered. "I can't do this," she whispered, her voice broken. "I thought I could, but I can't. I don't know how to be a mother. I don't know how to protect her." Thomas moved slowly into the room, removing his coat and gloves with deliberate care. He'd learned that sudden movements or loud sounds could startle Clara into retreat, particularly when she was already distressed. "What happened?" he asked gently, settling into the chair across from her. Clara wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, trying to compose herself. She wouldn't stop crying, for hours, and I couldn't figure out what was wrong. What if she'd been sick? What if something had been really wrong? There's no doctor, no one to help. She could die out here and it would be my fault for bringing her to this place. Thomas studied the baby, who had quieted now in response to her mother's calmer demeanor. Rose appeared perfectly healthy, alert, responsive, growing steadily. But Thomas understood that Clara's fear had little to do with the baby's actual condition. "Babies cry," Thomas said matter-of-factly. "It's what they do. Doesn't always mean something's wrong." "How would you know?" Clara snapped, then immediately looked stricken. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean—" "It's all right." Thomas leaned back in his chair, considering his words carefully. "I don't know about babies, but I know about being responsible for something helpless. Lost a lot of calves over the years. Some despite doing everything right. Others survived when by all rights they should have died. Sometimes there's no explaining why." Clara's tears had stopped, but her breathing remained unsteady. "What if I make the wrong choices? What if I can't give her what she needs?" "Then you figure it out as you go," Thomas said. "Same as everyone else." Clara looked down at Rose, who had fallen asleep against her shoulder. "My mother used to say that some women weren't meant to be mothers, that it took a certain kind of strength, a certain kind of knowing." "And you believed her?" Clara was quiet for a long moment. "I wanted to prove her wrong. But what if she was right? What if I'm just like her, cold, bitter, unable to love properly?" Thomas saw the heart of Clara's fear now. It wasn't really about her ability to care for Rose. It was about her ability to love without causing damage, to nurture without repeating the patterns of rejection she'd experienced. "Tell me about your mother," Thomas said. Clara shifted Rose to a more comfortable position, buying time to organize her thoughts. "Ruth Whitmore. Born and raised in Nebraska, married my father when she was 18, had 3 babies before me, 2 boys who died in infancy, a girl who lived to be 4 before the fever took her. Thomas waited, sensing there was more. I think losing those children broke something in her. By the time I came along, she'd learned not to love too much, not to hope too much. She fed me, clothed me, kept me safe, but she never made me feel wanted. And when you needed her most, she turned away. Clara nodded, tears threatening again. She said I'd made my choice, that I had to live with the consequences. Even after I told her about Jimmy Morrison, about what he'd done, she said it was my fault for putting myself in that situation. Thomas felt anger rise in his chest, not at Clara, but at the people who had failed her so completely. A pregnant girl thrown from a train should have been met with protection and care, not judgment and abandonment. What happened with Morrison? Thomas asked quietly. Clara looked out the window at the snow-covered landscape, as if the story she was about to tell lay somewhere in that white emptiness. He was the banker's son, handsome, charming, from one of the most respected families in town. I was 17, naive, flattered by his attention. Clara's voice grew flat, detached. He said he loved me, that we'd be married as soon as he finished his business education back east. I believed him. Thomas could see where this was leading, but he let Clara tell it at her own pace. It happened in his father's office after a church social. I didn't want to, but he said it was what people did when they loved each other. That it would be all right, because we were going to be married anyway. Clara's grip on Rose tightened slightly. Afterward, he acted like nothing had happened. When I tried to talk to him about it, he pretended not to understand what I meant. And when you realized you were with child? I told him privately first, thinking he'd do the right thing. He laughed and said I was trying to trap him into marriage with some other man's bastard. When I insisted the baby was his, he got angry, said if I spread lies about him, he'd make sure everyone knew what kind of girl I really was. Thomas understood. Now why Clara had been so terrified of the men on the train, why she feared discovery more than death. Morrison hadn't just abandoned her. He'd actively worked to silence her. Those men who threw you from the train, they worked for him. Clara nodded. I think he was afraid I'd cause trouble once I got to Chicago. Maybe write letters back home or find some way to prove he was the father. It was easier to make sure I never arrived at all. The enormity of what had been done to Clara struck Thomas with renewed force. She'd been abandoned by her family, betrayed by her lover, nearly murdered by hired men, and left to die in the snow. Yet somehow she'd survived it all, and now she sat in his kitchen holding her baby and worrying that she might not be capable of love. Clara, Thomas said, his voice gentle but firm. Look at me. She raised her eyes to meet his. The way you hold Rose, the way you protect her, the way you worry about her, that's love. Your mother may have been broken, but you're not her. You're not cold or bitter. You're strong and brave and determined to do better. Clara's composure crumbled again, but this time the tears seemed cleaner somehow, less desperate. I'm scared, Thomas. I'm scared of failing her the way everyone failed me. Then don't, Thomas said simply. Choose to be different. Choose to love her the way you wish you'd been loved. Clara looked down at Rose, who stirred slightly in her sleep, but remained peaceful. It sounds so easy when you say it like that. It's not easy, Thomas admitted, but it's possible, and you're not doing it alone. The words hung in the air between them, carrying implications that neither of them was quite ready to examine. Thomas had meant them as comfort, as reassurance that Clara had support in her efforts to raise Rose. But as soon as he spoke them, he realized they carried a deeper promise, that he was committed not just to helping Clara through this difficult time, but to being part of whatever future she chose to build. Clara seemed to recognize the weight of his words as well. She studied, his face with an intensity that made him suddenly aware of how much his feelings toward her had evolved over the weeks since he'd found her by the tracks. What had begun as simple Christian duty had deepened into something more complex. Protective instinct, certainly, but also genuine affection and growing attraction to the woman beneath the wounded exterior. "Why?" Clara asked quietly. "Why are you doing this? Taking care of us, asking nothing in return?" Thomas considered the question seriously. He could have given simple answers. Duty, compassion, loneliness, all of those would have been partially true, but Clara deserved better than partial truths. "At first, because it was the right thing to do," he said, "but that's not why anymore." "Then why?" Thomas looked at her, really looked at her, seeing not the broken woman he'd rescued, but the whole person she was becoming. Strong, resilient, determined to build something good from the wreckage of her past. Beautiful, not just in the conventional sense, but in the deeper way that came from courage and kindness, and the refusal to let cruelty make her cruel in return. "Because I care about you," he said simply. "Both of you. Because this house feels like home for the first time since my father died. Because when I'm out working the ranch, I look forward to coming back here, to seeing you and Rose, to sharing meals and talking about small things that feel important." Clara's breath caught. "Thomas, you don't have to say anything." Thomas continued, "I know you're not ready to think about that yet. Maybe you never will be, but you asked why, and that's why, not out of duty or pity, but because somewhere along the way, I started loving you." The admission surprised Thomas almost as much as it did Clara. He hadn't planned to declare his feelings, hadn't even fully acknowledged them to himself. But saying the words aloud felt like a weight lifting from his chest, even as it created new tension between them. Clara stared at him in silence, Rose sleeping peacefully in her arms. Thomas could see her mind working, processing his declaration against her own confused feelings, her fear of trusting another man, her uncertainty about what kind of future was possible for a woman in her circumstances. "I don't know how to love someone," she whispered finally. "I've never been shown how." "You're learning," Thomas said. "Every day with Rose, you're learning." Clara looked down at her daughter, then back at Thomas. "What if I hurt you? What if—" "I can't be what you need." "What if you can?" Thomas countered gently. "What if instead of worrying about all the ways this could go wrong, we focused on the ways it might go right?" Clara was quiet for a long time, considering his words. Rose stirred in her arms, making the small sounds that indicated she would soon wake and want to nurse. The practical demands of caring for an infant would soon intrude on this moment of emotional vulnerability. But for now, they sat in the kind of silence that felt full rather than empty. "I need time," Clara said finally, "to heal, to figure out who I am now, to learn how to trust again." "You have all the time you need," Thomas assured her. "I'm not going anywhere." Clara nodded, then surprised him by reaching across the table to touch his hand briefly. Her fingers were soft but calloused from work, warm from holding Rose. The contact lasted only a moment, but it felt like a promise. Not of love, not yet, but of possibility. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for saving us, for caring about us, for being patient with me." "Thank you," Thomas replied, "for trusting me enough to stay." Rose woke then, demanding attention with the imperious cries of the very young. Clara rose to tend to her, and the moment of intimate conversation passed into the routine tasks of daily life. But something had changed between them. A wall had come down, or a door had opened. Thomas couldn't be sure which, but he felt the shift like spring warmth after a hard winter. That evening, as Clara sat by the fire nursing Rose, while Thomas read aloud from a book of poetry his aunt had sent from Topeka, the atmosphere in the house felt different. Not charged with romantic tension, but softened by acknowledged feeling, by the recognition that what was growing between them had moved beyond mere convenience or circumstance. Later, after Clara had taken Rose upstairs to bed, she paused in the doorway of the kitchen where Thomas sat checking his account books by lamplight. "Thomas?" she said quietly. He looked up from his figures. "I do care about you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want you to know that. I may not know how to love properly yet, but I do care." Before Thomas could respond, she disappeared, up the stairs, leaving him alone with the ledger books and the warm glow of acknowledged mutual feeling. Outside, the wind howled with undiminished fury, but inside the house something had fundamentally shifted. The harsh winter was far from over, and Clara's journey toward healing had only just begun. But for the first time since he'd found her, broken in the snow, Thomas allowed himself to hope that spring might bring more than just better weather. It might bring the possibility of a real future built on the foundation of trust and care they were slowly constructing together, one honest conversation at a time. March arrived with deceptive gentleness, bringing days when the sun felt almost warm against the face and the snow began its slow retreat from the prairie. Clara found herself standing at the kitchen window more often, watching the landscape emerge from winter's grip like something being born. The baby weight she'd lost during those first traumatic weeks was returning, and Rose had grown sturdy and alert, her dark eyes tracking movement with increasing interest. Thomas had begun preparing for spring roundup, spending long hours in the barn repairing tack and checking supplies. The work would require additional hands, and Clara knew he'd been putting off hiring the seasonal cowboys he normally employed. She suspected his reluctance had to do with protecting her privacy, but she also sensed his growing unease about something he hadn't shared. It was during the second week of March that Clara's carefully constructed sanctuary began to show its first cracks. She was hanging laundry on the line Thomas had strung between two oak trees when she saw the dust cloud on the horizon. At first, she thought it might be Thomas returning early from checking the north pasture, but the dust was too extensive for a single rider. Clara gathered the remaining wet clothes and hurried inside, her heart already beginning to race with unnamed dread. From the kitchen window, she could see the approaching riders more clearly now. 3 men on horseback, moving at a steady pace directly toward the ranch house. Rose slept peacefully in her cradle, unaware of her mother's sudden tension. Clara checked the rifle Thomas kept above the kitchen door, making sure it was loaded, though she'd never fired anything larger than her father's old shotgun. Her hands shook as she returned to the window to watch the riders approach. They weren't cowboys or neighboring ranchers. Even at a distance, Clara could see they rode like men with specific purpose, their formation too organized to be casual. As they drew closer, details became clearer. City clothes beneath heavy coats, horses that looked rested rather than trail-worn, the unhurried confidence of men who expected no resistance. Clara's blood turned to ice water as she recognized the lead rider. Tall, sandy-haired, wearing the same expensive coat he'd worn on the train. One of Jimmy Morrison's hired killers, the man who had thrown her into the Kansas night to die. The pale-eyed man had survived whatever consequences might have followed. Clara's disappearance, and now he'd tracked her to the one place she'd believed was safe. Behind him rode 2 companions Clara didn't recognize, both younger but carrying themselves with the same casual menace. Clara scooped Rose from her cradle and retreated to the back of the house, her mind racing through impossible options. Thomas was at least an hour away, checking cattle in the distant pastures. The nearest neighbor lived 12 miles south, too far to reach for help, even if she could somehow get past the approaching men. She considered taking Rose and fleeing, on foot toward the creek bottom. But the baby would slow her down, and the open prairie offered no concealment. The barn might provide temporary shelter, but it would also trap her with no means of escape. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, then stopped entirely as the riders reached the house. Clara crouched behind the kitchen table, Rose clutched against her chest, listening to the creak of leather and the low murmur of male voices. Footsteps approached the front door, deliberate and unhurried. 3 sharp knocks echoed through the house. "Mrs. Brennan." The voice was mockingly polite, coloured with false courtesy. "We'd like to have a word with you, if you don't mind." Clara remained silent, hoping they might believe the house was empty. Rose stirred against her shoulder, but didn't wake. "Now, we know you're in there," the voice continued. "Saw you hanging laundry not 20 minutes ago. No point in making this difficult." Another voice, younger and impatient. "Maybe she can't hear us. Should we check around back?" "Patience, boys. She'll come around." Clara heard footsteps circling the house, testing windows and doors. Thomas had been thorough about security, but determined men could always find a way inside if they were willing to break things. "Clara Whitmore!" The pale-eyed man's voice was louder now, no longer bothering with false politeness. "Or should I call you Mrs. Brennan? Interesting how quickly you've settled into domestic life." The use of Thomas's name sent fresh terror through Clara. These men knew exactly who lived here, which meant they'd been watching, planning, gathering information before making their approach. "Here's the situation," the voice continued, apparently addressing the closed door. "Mr. Morrison has some concerns about loose ends. Seems there's been some talk back home about what might have happened to poor Clara Whitmore. Questions being asked, fingers being pointed. Makes him uncomfortable." Clara closed her eyes, trying to think through her panic. If Morrison was worried about questions, it meant her disappearance hadn't been as clean as he'd hoped. Perhaps her father had made inquiries, or the train conductor had remembered something suspicious. "The thing is," the pale-eyed man went on, "dead girls don't usually turn up playing house with ranchers. Creates complications Mr. Morrison would prefer to avoid." A new voice, harder than the others. "Enough talking. Let's just go in and finish this. Now, let's give the lady a chance to be reasonable. Clara, honey, why don't you come on out so we can discuss this like civilized people?" Rose chose that moment to wake, her small cry cutting through the tense silence like a blade. Clara tried to quiet her, but the sound had already given away. Their position, well, the pale-eyed man said with obvious satisfaction. "Sounds like congratulations are in order. When's the happy event?" Clara knew she was trapped. They would break in eventually, and when they did, she'd be defenseless with Rose in her arms. Her only chance was to face them on her own terms, to try to negotiate for her daughter's life, even if she couldn't save her own. She stood slowly, Rose still crying against her shoulder, and walked to the front door. Her hand trembled as she turned the key in the lock. The pale-eyed man stood on the porch steps, flanked by his 2 companions. Up close, Clara could see he'd aged in the months since the train incident. New lines around his eyes, a hardness that suggested recent violence had become routine rather than exceptional. "There she is," he said with a smile that held no warmth, looking remarkably healthy for a dead woman. "What do you want?" Clara managed, though her voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "Same thing we wanted on the train. For you to disappear quietly. Only now it's more complicated, isn't it?" His gaze flicked to Rose, still crying in Clara's arms. Mr. Morrison didn't account for additions to the family. The younger man beside him shifted impatiently. "Can we just get this done? I don't like being exposed out here." "All in good time," the pale-eyed man said. "First, I'm curious about something. This rancher who took you in, does he know the truth about his little family? Does he know he's been harboring Jimmy Morrison's whore and bastard?" The crude words hit Clara like physical blows, but she forced herself to remain steady. "He knows everything he needs to know." "Does he now?" The man's smile widened. "And when he learns what kind of woman you really are, what you did to earn yourself a train ride to nowhere, think he'll still want to play daddy to Morrison's brat?" Clara felt something inside her shift and harden. These men could threaten her, could probably kill her, but she would not let them poison what she'd built with Thomas through their lies and manipulation. "Thomas knows exactly who I am," she said, her voice growing stronger. "He knows about Jimmy Morrison, about what happened on the train, about everything, and he chose to help us anyway." The pale-eyed man's smile faded slightly. This wasn't the reaction he'd expected. "Well," he said after a pause, "then I suppose Mr. Brennan is going to have some explaining to do when folks start asking questions about his dead houseguests." It was then that Clara heard the sound that would change everything. The thunder of approaching hoofbeats, multiple horses moving fast across the prairie. The three men turned toward the sound, hands moving instinctively toward their weapons. Thomas appeared over the rise south of the house, but he wasn't alone. Beside him rode Sheriff Jake Martinez from Hayes and 2 deputies, all of them armed and riding with purpose. Behind them came 4 more men Clara didn't recognize, all carrying rifles and wearing badges that caught the afternoon sunlight. The pale-eyed man cursed under his breath, his hand moving toward the gun at his hip. But he was smart enough to recognize impossible odds when he saw them. "Seems your husband has friends," he said to Clara, his voice tight with frustrated anger. Thomas and the lawman reached the house in a cloud of dust and jangling spurs. The sheriff, a weather-beaten man in his 50s, dismounted with practiced ease and approached the porch with his rifle ready, but not raised. "Gentlemen," Sheriff Martinez said in a voice that carried absolute authority, "I'm going to need to see some identification." The pale-eyed man straightened, trying to project innocent confusion. "I'm sorry, Sheriff, but I think there's been some misunderstanding. We're just here visiting with Mrs. Brennan about some family business." "That's so?" Thomas dismounted and approached the porch, his face set in lines Clara had never seen before. "Clara, are these men bothering you?" Clara looked at Thomas, then at the sheriff, then back at the 3 men who had come to kill her. For months she'd lived in fear of this moment, but now that it had arrived, she found herself filled not with terror, but with cold, clear anger. "Sheriff Martinez," she said, her voice carrying across the yard. "These men threw me from a moving train last December. They were hired to murder me and my unborn child." The words fell into sudden silence. The pale-eyed man's face went white, then flushed with desperate calculation. "That's a serious accusation, ma'am," Sheriff Martinez said gravely. "You prepared to swear to that in court?" "I am." The pale-eyed man laughed, but it sounded forced and hollow. "Sheriff, you can't seriously believe—" "What I believe," Martinez interrupted, "is that 3 men from Kansas have been asking questions around Hayes about a missing girl and a rancher who might be harboring her. What I believe is that when decent folks start getting nervous about strangers asking too many questions, it's time for the law to get involved." Thomas stepped closer to Clara, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, despite the cool air. "Clara, are you and Rose all right?" She nodded, still holding the baby protectively. Rose had quieted, perhaps sensing the tension, and now watched the proceedings with the alert attention of the very young. "The thing about murder for hire," Sheriff Martinez continued conversationally, "is that it tends to leave trails. Money, changing hands, witnesses who remember suspicious characters, train conductors who file reports about missing passengers." The pale-eyed man's confidence was cracking now, desperation showing around the edges. "You can't prove anything." "Maybe not yet," Martinez admitted. "But I've got jurisdiction in this county, and I take a dim view of armed men threatening young mothers. So here's what's going to happen. You boys are going to surrender your weapons and come with me to Hayes, where we can sort this out proper." "You can't arrest us," the younger man protested. "We haven't done anything wrong. Carrying concealed weapons without permits, threatening behavior, trespassing. I can find plenty of charges to hold you while I investigate this attempted murder claim." Clara watched the three men exchange glances, calculating their chances. Against 7 armed lawmen. Even desperate men weren't usually stupid enough to fight those odds. The pale-eyed man seemed to reach the same conclusion. "This isn't over," he said quietly, his gaze fixed on Clara. "Mr. Morrison has a long reach and a longer memory." "Mr. Morrison," Thomas said, speaking for the first time since dismounting, "can reach all he wants. Clara and Rose are under my protection now, and I don't back down from threats." Something in Thomas's voice, quiet, absolute, deadly serious, made all three men take a step back. Clara realized that the gentle rancher who had saved her life was showing another side of himself, the part that came from generations of men who had survived on the frontier through strength and determination. Sheriff Martinez gestured to his deputies. "Take their weapons and get them mounted. We're heading back to Hayes." As the lawmen moved to disarm and arrest Morrison's men, Thomas turned to Clara with an expression of deep concern mixed with barely controlled anger. "How long have you known they were coming?" he asked quietly. "I didn't," Clara admitted. "I saw them approaching and recognized one of them from the train. I was hoping they'd just go away." Thomas shook his head. "Clara, you can't face this kind of danger alone. Not anymore." She looked at him, then at Rose, then at the men being loaded onto horses under guard. "How did you know to bring the sheriff?" "I didn't bring him. He was already looking for these men based on reports from the railroad about missing passengers and suspicious activity. When he came to ask if I'd seen anything unusual, I told him about finding you by the tracks." Clara felt a complex mix of relief and apprehension. The immediate danger was passing, but the confrontation had made everything public. There would be questions, investigations, possibly a trial where she'd have to relive every detail of her trauma. "What happens now?" she asked. Sheriff Martinez approached, having finished supervising the arrests. "Now we see if we can build a case that will stick. Your testimony will be crucial, Mrs. Brennan, but it won't be easy. Men like this usually have resources, lawyers, connections." Clara noticed he'd called her Mrs. Brennan, and she glanced at Thomas uncertainly. They'd never discussed marriage, had barely begun to acknowledge their feelings for each other. "Whatever it takes," Thomas said firmly. "Clara's been through enough. It's time for justice." As the sheriff and his prisoners rode away toward Hayes, Clara found herself alone with Thomas for the first time since the confrontation began. Rose had fallen asleep again, exhausted by the day's excitement, and the afternoon sun was beginning to slant toward evening. "Thomas," Clara said quietly, "about what the sheriff called me." "We'll figure that out," Thomas said, his voice gentle again now that the immediate threat had passed. "Right now, I'm just glad you're safe." Clara looked at him, really looked at him, seeing not just the man who had rescued her from the snow, but the man who had brought the law to protect her, who had faced down killers without flinching, who had claimed her and Rose as his own in front of witnesses. "Why?" she asked. "Why did you tell the sheriff we were married?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "Because it was the simplest way to make sure he understood you were under my protection. Because it gave you legal standing to testify without having to explain other things. Because it felt true, even if it isn't official yet." Clara felt something shift inside her, a wall finally crumbling under the weight of Thomas's consistent care and protection. This man had saved her life, delivered her baby, defended her against killers, and claimed her as his wife before the law, all while asking nothing in return except the chance to love her. "Thomas," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "if you meant what you said to the sheriff about me being your wife, then ask me properly." Thomas turned to face her fully, his eyes searching her face. "Clara Whitmore, will you marry me? Will you let me be a husband to you and a father to Rose? Will you help me turn this house into a real home?" Clara looked down at Rose, sleeping peacefully in her arms, then back at Thomas. The man who had shown her what love could look like when it came without conditions, without cruelty, without the expectation of payment for kindness given. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will." Thomas stepped closer, close enough to put his arms around both Clara and Rose, careful not to wake the sleeping baby. For the first time since that night on the train, Clara allowed herself to believe that safety might be more than temporary, that love might be possible, that the future might hold something better than mere survival. Behind them, the sun continued, its descent toward the western horizon, painting the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. The harsh winter was truly ending now, giving way to the promise of spring, of new beginnings, of hope taking root in ground that had been frozen too long. But even as Clara embraced the possibility of happiness, she knew their troubles were far from over. Jimmy Morrison's reach was long, his resources considerable, and his need to keep her silent had only grown more desperate. The trial would be difficult, the accusations hard to prove, the danger ongoing. Still, for the first time since she'd learned of her pregnancy back in Nebraska, Clara felt she wasn't facing the future alone. Whatever came next, she would meet it with Thomas beside her, with Rose in her arms, and with the knowledge that some forms of love were strong enough to survive even the harshest storms. The past had finally caught up with her, but instead of destroying her sanctuary, it had only made her more determined to defend it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, Clara Whitmore had a family, a home, and the promise of a man who loved her enough to stand between her and the darkness that had pursued her across half the continent. The healing could continue, the growth could begin, and for the first time in her young life, Clara allowed herself to believe that she deserved both. The Hayes County Courthouse stood like a monument to frontier justice, its red brick walls weathered by prairie winds and decades of disputes over cattle, water rights, and the sometimes violent disagreements that came with carving civilization from wilderness. Clara had never been inside a courtroom before, and as she climbed the worn stone steps with Rose in her arms and Thomas at her side, she felt the weight of every curious stare from the townspeople gathered to witness what the local newspaper had sensationally dubbed the train murder trial. Word had spread quickly through the county about the young mother who'd survived being thrown from a moving train, the rancher who'd rescued her, and the hired killers who'd come to finish the job. In a territory where entertainment was scarce and justice was often swift and final, the trial had drawn spectators from 3 counties away. Clara wore her best dress, a blue calico that Thomas's sister had sent from Topeka, and had pinned her hair in the severe style that seemed appropriate for such serious proceedings. Rose, now 4 months old and thriving, dozed peacefully in her mother's arms, blissfully unaware of the drama unfolding around her. The past month had been a whirlwind of depositions, meetings with the territorial prosecutor, and visits from investigators piecing together the connections between Jimmy Morrison, his hired killers, and Clara's near-death experience. Sheriff Martinez had proven remarkably thorough in his investigation, tracking down the train conductor who remembered the suspicious men, finding witnesses who could place Morrison's agents in various towns along Clara's route, and even discovering financial records showing suspicious payments from Morrison's father's bank. Thomas had remained steadfast throughout the entire process, never wavering in his support for Clara, despite the gossip and speculation that swirled through the community. Some folks whispered that he was a fool for marrying damaged goods, that Clara was probably lying about the whole affair to trap herself as a husband. Others, particularly the women, seemed to understand the truth of what Clara had endured and rallied to her defense. The wedding itself had been a quiet affair, conducted by Judge Harrison in his chambers 3 weeks after the arrests. Clara had worn her mother's wedding ring, the one she'd thought lost forever, until Thomas revealed he'd found it sewn into the lining of her torn coat. The ceremony was witnessed by Sheriff Martinez and his wife, a kind woman named Elena, who had insisted on bringing flowers from her own garden and a cake that made Rose gurgle with delight when Clara let her taste a tiny bit of frosting. Now, as they entered the courthouse, Clara felt the full weight of what the next few days would bring. She would have to testify publicly about Jimmy Morrison's assault, about the brutal men who'd thrown her from the train, about lying broken and bleeding in the snow while carrying his child. Every private shame would become public record, every detail of her violation dissected by lawyers and judged by strangers. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and crammed into every available space. Clara recognized some faces from town, shopkeepers, ranchers, farmers who'd driven in for the spectacle. Others were strangers, drawn by curiosity or the darker impulses that made people slow down to stare at accidents. At the defendant's table sat the three men who'd tried to murder her. The pale-eyed leader, whose name she'd learned was Franklin Pierce, no relation to the former president, looked older and harder than he had on the day of his arrest. His two companions, identified as brothers named Carl and David Webb, appeared nervous and kept glancing toward the packed gallery as if looking for friendly faces they wouldn't find. The prosecution table was occupied by territorial prosecutor James Wellington, a sharp-featured man in his 40s who'd earned a reputation for thoroughness in pursuing frontier justice. He'd spent considerable time with Clara preparing her testimony, and she'd been impressed by his genuine concern for her welfare rather than just his case. The defense had hired expensive lawyers from Kansas City, men in fine suits who exuded the confidence that came with representing clients who could afford the best legal talent available. Clara had no illusions about what their strategy would be: destroy her credibility, paint her as a willing participant in her own ruin, suggest that her testimony was motivated by greed or revenge rather than truth. Judge Harrison, a man Clara had grown to respect during the legal proceedings leading up to the trial, called the court to order with the gravity that such cases demanded. His opening remarks made it clear that he understood the significance of what they were about to hear. Not just a criminal case, but a test of whether a woman's word could stand against the power and money of men determined to escape consequences. Prosecutor Wellington's opening statement was methodical and devastating. He laid out a timeline of Jimmy Morrison's seduction and abandonment of Clara, her pregnancy and desperate flight to Chicago, the hiring of Pierce and the Webb brothers to eliminate the problem she represented, and her miraculous survival of an attempted murder that should have left no witnesses. The defense's opening was predictably vicious. They painted Clara as a scheming woman who had tried to trap Jimmy Morrison into marriage through false accusations, who had fabricated the entire story to cover her own promiscuous behavior, and who was now seeking revenge and financial gain. Through perjured testimony against innocent men, Clara sat through it all with Thomas's hand steady on her shoulder, Rose peaceful in her arms. She'd known the attacks would come, had prepared herself for the humiliation of having her most private pain displayed for public consumption. But hearing her character assassinated in open court still felt like physical blows. The prosecution's case unfolded methodically over the next 2 days. The train conductor testified about the suspicious behavior of 3 men who'd boarded at Wichita, their interest in the young pregnant woman traveling alone, and his own unease about their intentions. A bank clerk from Morrison's father's institution testified about unusual cash withdrawals that corresponded to the dates of Pierce's employment. A doctor from Hayes testified about Clara's injuries when Thomas had brought her to town, confirming that they were consistent with a fall from a moving train. When it came time for Clara to testify, the courtroom fell silent. Even the restless children in the gallery seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. Clara handed Rose to Thomas, kissed her daughter's forehead, and walked to the witness stand with as much dignity as she could muster. Prosecutor Wellington guided her through, her testimony with careful respect for her emotional state. Clara told her story simply and directly. The seduction by Jimmy Morrison, the discovery of her pregnancy, her family's rejection, her desperate journey toward Chicago, and the terrifying confrontation with Pierce and his men between the train and cars. Her voice remained steady throughout most of her testimony, but it broke when she described lying in the snow, feeling her baby moving weakly inside her, believing she was about to die alone and forgotten. Several women in the gallery wept openly, and even some of the men looked uncomfortable with the details of what Clara had endured. The cross-examination was brutal, but expected. The defense attorney attacked every aspect of Clara's character and credibility, suggesting she was a woman of loose morals who had seduced multiple men and was now seeking to profit from false accusations. He questioned her memory of events, suggesting trauma had confused her recollections, and implied that her marriage to Thomas was proof of her mercenary nature. Clara answered every question calmly and honestly, never losing her temper, despite the lawyer's obvious attempts to provoke her into emotional outbursts that might undermine her credibility. When he suggested that Rose might not even be Jimmy Morrison's child, Clara looked at the jury and said simply, "I have never been with any man except Jimmy Morrison and my husband Thomas. My daughter deserves better than to have her parentage." Questioned by men who tried to murder her before she was born, the defense attorney's final attack was the most vicious. "Isn't it true, Mrs. Brennan, that you seduced Jimmy Morrison deliberately, hoping to trap him into marriage? And when that failed, didn't you concoct this entire story about attempted murder to get revenge against a man whose only crime was refusing to be blackmailed?" Clara looked at the lawyer for a long moment, then at the jury, then at Thomas holding Rose in the gallery. When she spoke, her voice carried across the silent courtroom with perfect clarity. "Sir, I was 17 years old, raised to believe that when a man said he loved you, he meant it. I was naive enough to think that physical intimacy meant emotional commitment. I was foolish enough to trust someone who saw my innocence as an opportunity rather than something to be protected." Clara paused, gathering her strength for the rest. "But I was never mercenary enough to fake attempted murder, and I was never desperate enough to perjure myself in a court of law. Those men threw me from a train to silence me, and by God's grace, I survived to tell the truth." The defense attorney sat down without further questions. The prosecution's rebuttal witnesses included Thomas, who testified about finding Clara broken and bleeding beside the railroad tracks, and Sheriff Martinez, who described the investigation that had led to the arrests. Most compelling was a surprise witness, a fellow passenger from the train who had seen Clara being forced between the cars by 3 men and had wondered what had happened to the young pregnant woman when she wasn't on the train the next morning. When the prosecution rested its case, Clara felt exhausted but strangely relieved. She had told her truth publicly, faced down her attackers in open court, and survived the ordeal with her dignity intact. Whatever the jury decided, she had done what she came to do. The defense case was brief and focused primarily on character. Witnesses for the defendants, men who testified to their general good reputation and law-abiding nature. Notably absent was any testimony from Jimmy Morrison himself, though Clara learned from Prosecutor Wellington that Morrison had been served with a subpoena but had failed to appear, claiming urgent business matters kept him in the Eastern Territories. Closing. Arguments were scheduled for the 4th day of the trial. Clara sat in the gallery with Rose, Thomas beside her, as Wellington summarized the evidence against Pierce and the Webb brothers. His argument was passionate but controlled, focusing on the facts rather than emotion, building a logical case that the defendants had been hired to commit murder and had nearly succeeded. The defense's closing argument was a desperate attempt to muddy the waters, suggesting that reasonable doubt existed about the defendant's guilt, that Clara's testimony was unreliable, and that the entire case was built on the word of a woman seeking revenge against men who had done nothing more than take a train ride. Judge Harrison's instructions to the jury were clear and comprehensive, explaining the legal standards for attempted murder, conspiracy, and the weight to be given to victim testimony in cases where few other witnesses existed. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Clara and Thomas waited in a small room behind the courthouse, Rose sleeping peacefully between them on a borrowed blanket. They spoke little during the long wait, both understanding that their future might well depend on the decision of 12 Kansas farmers and townsmen who had spent 4 days listening to the most private details of Clara's life. When the bailiff finally called them back into the courtroom, Clara's hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold Rose. The jury filed in with the grave expressions of men who had wrestled with serious questions about life, death, and justice on the frontier. The foreman, a weathered rancher Clara recognized from the general store, stood when Judge Harrison asked for the verdict. "Your Honor, we, the jury, find the defendant Franklin Pierce guilty of attempted murder in the first degree, conspiracy to commit murder, and assault with intent to kill." Clara's knees nearly buckled with relief. "We find the defendant Carl Webb guilty of attempted murder in the first degree, conspiracy to commit murder, and assault with intent to kill." Thomas's arm tightened around Clara's shoulders. "We find the defendant David Webb guilty of attempted murder in the first degree, conspiracy to commit murder, and assault with intent to kill." The courtroom erupted in noise, gasps, murmurs, and scattered applause that Judge Harrison quickly gavelled down. Clara felt tears streaming down her face, not just from relief, but from the overwhelming realization that 12 strangers had believed her, had seen past the character assassination and the victim blaming to recognize the truth of what had been done to her. Judge Harrison scheduled sentencing for the following week, but the guilty verdicts meant that Pierce and the Webb brothers would spend decades in territorial prison. More importantly, their convictions sent a message that would reach Jimmy Morrison and anyone else who thought pregnant women could be discarded like inconvenient trash. Outside the courthouse, Clara found herself surrounded by well-wishers, women who had followed the trial and seen their own struggles reflected in her story, men who respected her courage in facing down her attackers, neighbors who welcomed her officially into the community she had inadvertently joined by falling in love with one of their own. Mrs. Elena Martinez approached with tears in her eyes. "Mija," she said, using the Spanish endearment that made Clara's heart warm. "You were so brave in there, so strong." "I had to be," Clara replied, adjusting Rose in her arms. "For her. And for yourself," Elena added. "Don't forget to be proud. Of yourself, too." As the crowd began to disperse and the excitement of the trial's conclusion settled into the everyday rhythms of frontier life, Clara and Thomas walked slowly toward their wagon for the ride back to the ranch. The spring evening was warm and peaceful, with the scent of growing things carried on a gentle breeze. "How do you feel?" Thomas asked as he helped Clara and Rose into the wagon seat. Clara considered the question seriously. "Different," she said. "Finally, like something heavy has been lifted off my shoulders. Like I can breathe properly for the first time in months." Thomas climbed up beside her and gathered the reins. "The jury did the right thing." "They did more than that," Clara said, looking back at the courthouse where she had finally received Justice for the wrongs done to her. They gave me my voice back. They said my word matters, that what happened to me was wrong, that I deserved protection instead of punishment. As they rode through haze toward the open prairie, Clara reflected on how completely her life had changed since that terrible night on the train. She had been broken, abandoned, left for dead. But somehow, through Thomas's love and her own determination to survive, she had found not just safety but belonging. She had a husband who chose her daily, a daughter who would grow up knowing she was wanted, and a community that had judged her worthy of protection and respect. The ranch came into view just as the sun was setting behind them, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. The house looked welcoming in the evening light, smoke rising from the chimney where Thomas had banked the morning fire. The cattle grazed peacefully in the distance, and Clara could see the garden plot where she planned to plant vegetables once the danger of late frost had passed. "Home," she said softly, the word carrying more meaning than it ever had before. "Home," Thomas agreed, his hand covering hers on Rose's blanket. That evening, after Rose had been fed and settled in her cradle, Clara and Thomas sat on the front porch watching the stars emerge in the clear Kansas sky. They spoke quietly of practical things: the spring planting, the cattle that would need branding, the ranch hands Thomas would hire now that the trial was over, and their privacy was no longer paramount. But underneath the ordinary conversation lay a deeper current of contentment and hope. Clara had chosen to stay, not just physically but emotionally. She had committed herself fully to this life, this man, this future they would build together from the ashes of her past. "I got a letter from my father today," Clara said eventually, pulling an envelope from her apron pocket. Thomas looked surprised. "I didn't know you'd written to him." "I didn't. Sheriff Martinez did, after the arrests. He thought my family should know what had really happened to me." Clara unfolded the letter, reading it by the light that spilled from the kitchen window. Her father's handwriting was careful and measured, the words of a man who had spent months believing his daughter was dead and was struggling to understand her resurrection. "He says my mother took to her bed when she heard the news," Clara continued. "Couldn't stop crying, kept saying she should have protected me better. He wants to know if they can come visit, if they can meet Rose and apologize properly." "What? Did you write back?" Thomas asked. Clara smiled, folding the letter carefully. "I haven't yet, but I think I'll tell him they're welcome here. Rose should know her grandparents, even if they made terrible mistakes. People deserve chances to do better." Thomas nodded approvingly. "Forgiveness is harder than holding grudges, but it's better for the soul." Clara leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady rhythm of his breathing. Rose stirred in her cradle, but didn't wake, content in the security of parents who would protect her and love her unconditionally. "Thomas," Clara said quietly, "yes, thank you for everything, for saving us, for loving us, for standing by us through all of this." Thomas pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Thank you for choosing to stay, for trusting me with your heart, for making this house a home." Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, bearing witness to promises made and kept, to love found in the most unlikely circumstances, to the truth that mercy sometimes came wearing muddy boots and carrying gentle hands. The harsh winter was a memory now. Spring was settling into the rhythm of summer, and Clara Brennan had everything she'd never dared to hope for: a family, a home, and the certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. The August sun was merciless in its intensity, beating down on the Kansas prairie with a heat that shimmered and danced above the wheat fields like liquid gold. But in the shade of the oak trees behind the Brennan ranch house, Clara sat contentedly shelling peas while 10-month-old Rose played with wooden blocks Thomas had carved during the long winter evenings. The baby had grown sturdy and bright, her dark hair catching copper highlights in the filtered sunlight, her laughter a constant music that filled spaces Clara hadn't even realized were empty. 15 months had passed since that terrible night on the train, and Clara sometimes had to remind herself that the broken, desperate girl who had boarded that Chicago-bound freight was the same woman who now managed a thriving household, tended a vegetable garden that was the envy of 3 counties, and woke each morning to the sound of her daughter's babbling and her husband's quiet movements as he prepared for another day of ranch work. The transformation hadn't been sudden or complete. Healing never was, but it had been steady and genuine. Clara could feel the change in her bones, in the way she carried herself, in the confidence with which she made decisions and voiced opinions. She was no longer the frightened girl seeking permission to exist. She had become a woman who knew her own worth and claimed her place in the world without apology. The sound of approaching horses drew her attention toward the front of the house. 3 riders were coming up the lane, Thomas returning from the north pasture with 2 of the seasonal hands he'd hired for summer work. Clara could see his familiar silhouette even at a distance, the easy way he sat his horse, the gentle authority with which he managed both animals and men. Watching him work had taught her things about leadership and strength that her father's defeated resignation and Jimmy Morrison's bullying arrogance never could. "Mama, up, up!" Rose demanded, abandoning her blocks to reach chubby arms toward Clara. Clara scooped her daughter onto her lap, marveling as she did every day at the perfect trust with which Rose settled against her. The baby had never known want or rejection, had never experienced anything but love and security. She would grow up understanding that she was cherished not as a burden to be endured, but as a gift to be celebrated. "Look, little bird," Clara murmured, pointing toward the riders. "Papa's coming home." Rose's face lit up with recognition, and she bounced excitedly in Clara's arms. Thomas had been Papa from the beginning, claiming Rose as completely as if she were his by blood. Clara had watched him struggle initially with the practical aspects of infant care, the feeding and diaper changing and middle-of-the-night crying, but his love for Rose had been immediate and unconditional. He sang to her in the mornings while Clara prepared breakfast, carried her on his shoulders while doing chores she was old enough to enjoy, and treated her with the tender patience of a man who understood that love wasn't about biology, but about choice. The riders reached the house as Clara was gathering her peas and Rose's toys. Thomas dismounted with the fluid grace of someone who had been riding since childhood, and approached them with the smile that still had the power to make Clara's heart skip unexpectedly. "How are my girls?" he asked, sweeping Rose from Clara's arms and tossing her gently into the air. Rose shrieked with delighted laughter, and Thomas caught her securely, planting kisses on her round cheeks until she giggled helplessly. "We're well," Clara replied, standing and brushing grass from her skirt. "The peas are ready for canning, and Rose learned a new word today." "Oh?" Thomas settled Rose against his hip, where she immediately began trying to grab his hat. "What word?" "Cookie," Clara said with a laugh. "Mrs. Patterson brought some ginger cookies when she came to visit, and now Rose asks for cookie every few minutes." Thomas grinned and looked down at his daughter. "Is that right, little bird? You learned to say cookie." "Cookie, cookie," Rose responded enthusiastically, clapping her hands. "I suppose we'll have to bake some cookies then," Thomas said. "Seriously, can't disappoint a lady who asks so nicely." Clara felt the familiar warmth that came from watching Thomas with Rose, from seeing the easy affection between them, from knowing that her daughter would grow up with a father who delighted in her existence rather than merely tolerating it. It was one of the many gifts Thomas had given them, the gift of ordinary family happiness, of belonging without conditions, of love that expected nothing in return except the chance to keep loving. As they walked toward the house together, Clara noticed Thomas glancing toward the main road with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Expecting someone?" she asked. Thomas hesitated, then nodded. Got word in town this morning. Your parents sent a telegram to the station agent. They're coming on tomorrow's stage. Clara stopped walking, surprised by the sudden flutter of anxiety in her chest. She'd been corresponding with her father regularly since the trial, slowly rebuilding a relationship that had been shattered by fear and misunderstanding. His letters had been full of remorse and awkward attempts at grandparents' affection for a child he'd never met. Her mother had added brief notes of her own, stiff and formal, but increasingly warm as the months passed. But the thought of seeing them in person, of watching them interact with Rose and Thomas, of navigating the complex emotions that still surrounded their abandonment of her during pregnancy, that felt suddenly overwhelming. How do you feel about that? Thomas asked gently, reading her expression with the accuracy that came from months of careful attention to her moods and needs. Clara considered the question seriously. Nervous, she admitted. It's been almost 2 years since I've seen them. We're all different people now. You don't have to see them if you're not ready, Thomas said. I can meet the stage, explain that you need more time. Clara looked at him, then at Rose, who was contentedly playing with the buttons on Thomas's shirt. Her daughter deserved to know her grandparents, and Henry and Ruth Whitmore deserved the chance to make amends for their failures. Clara had learned enough about forgiveness to understand that it was a gift she gave herself as much as others. No, Clara said firmly. I want to see them. I want them to meet Rose and to know how well we're doing. I want them to understand that their rejection didn't destroy us. It led us to something better. Thomas nodded approvingly. We'll prepare the guest room. I'll ask Elena Martinez if she can lend us her good china for dinner. Clara smiled at his thoughtfulness. Thomas understood instinctively that this visit mattered, that it represented a chance for healing that might not come again. He was already and thinking about how to make her parents feel welcome while ensuring that Clara felt supported and secure. That evening, after Rose had been fed and bathed and sung to sleep, Clara and Thomas sat at the kitchen table making plans for the visit. Thomas had suggested simple meals that wouldn't require Clara to spend all her time cooking, and Clara had decided to show her parents the garden, the improvements they'd made to the house, the life they'd built from nothing but determination and love. What if they don't approve of us? Clara asked suddenly, voicing the fear she'd been carrying since receiving the news. Approve of what? Thomas replied. Of you marrying a man who adores you, of you raising your daughter in a home full of love, of you building a life that makes you happy? Clara smiled at his indignation on her behalf. When you put it like that, it sounds silly. It is silly, Thomas said firmly. You don't need their approval anymore, Clara. You're not 17 and pregnant and desperate for someone to take care of you. You're a grown woman with a husband who loves you, a daughter who thinks you hung the moon, and a community that respects you. Their approval would be nice, but you don't need it to be happy. Clara reached across the table to take his hand. How did you get so wise? Living alone for too many years, Thomas replied with a wry smile. Gives a man time to think about what really matters. The next day dawned clear and warm, perfect weather for welcoming visitors. Clara spent the morning cleaning house and preparing food, not because she wanted to impress her parents, but because keeping busy helped calm her nerves. Rose seemed to sense the importance of the day and was unusually well behaved, content to play quietly while Clara worked. Thomas had arranged for one of the ranch hands to meet the stage and bring the Whitmores to the ranch, giving Clara time to compose herself before their arrival. She changed into her best dress, a green cotton that Thomas had bought her for their first wedding anniversary, and braided her hair in the style her mother had once taught her, a gesture toward connection that felt both natural and strange. When she heard the wagon coming up the lane, Clara's heart began racing, despite her best efforts to remain calm. She picked up Rose, who looked particularly adorable in a white dress with tiny embroidered flowers, and stood at the window, watching her parents approach their new home. Henry Whitmore looked older than Clara remembered, his hair completely grey. Now, his shoulders more stooped than they'd been when she left Nebraska. But his face lit up with joy when he saw the house, the well-tended property, the obvious signs of prosperity and care. Ruth sat beside him, her back straight as always, but Clara could see tears on her mother's cheeks, even from a distance. Thomas appeared at Clara's shoulder, solid and reassuring. "Ready?" Clara took a deep breath. "Ready." They walked out onto the porch together, a united front greeting visitors to their home. Henry helped Ruth down from the wagon with careful gentleness, and then both of Clara's parents stood in the yard, looking up at their daughter with expressions of wonder and regret and hope. For a moment, no one spoke. Clara saw her parents taking in the sight of her healthy, happy, obviously well-cared-for appearance. They saw Thomas standing protectively beside her, saw Rose in her arms, gurgling with baby contentment, saw the home they'd built together in the middle of the Kansas prairie. Henry was the first to move, climbing the porch steps slowly, as if approaching. Something precious he was afraid to break. "Clara," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "My dear girl." Clara felt tears threatening but held them back. "Papa." He stopped in front of her, his eyes moving from her face to Rose and back again. "She's beautiful," he whispered. "She looks just like you did at that age. Would you like to hold her?" Clara asked. Henry's face crumpled briefly before he composed himself. "May I?" Clara placed Rose gently in her grandfather's arms, watching as the baby studied this new face with the solemn interest she reserved for strangers. After a moment, Rose smiled, her wide, toothless grin that melted hearts, and Henry laughed with pure joy. Ruth had remained in the yard, watching this interaction with an expression Clara couldn't read. When their eyes met, Clara saw her mother's carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. "Mama," Clara said quietly. Ruth climbed the porch steps with the careful dignity that had characterized all her movements for as long as Clara could remember, but when she reached Clara, she did something she'd never done before. She pulled her daughter into a fierce embrace, holding her tightly as if she'd feared never having the chance again. "I'm sorry," Ruth whispered against Clara's hair. "I'm so sorry for everything. For not believing you, for not protecting you, for letting my own fear make me cruel." Clara felt years of hurt and anger dissolving in the face of her mother's genuine remorse. "It's all right, Mama. We're all right." Ruth pulled back to look at Clara's face, then at Rose, who was still contentedly settled in Henry's arms. "You are all right," she said with wonder. "Better than all right. You're thriving." Thomas stepped forward then, extending his hand to Henry. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm Thomas Brennan. Welcome to our home." Henry shifted Rose to one arm and shook Thomas's hand with obvious emotion. "Mr. Brennan, I can never thank you enough for what you've done for Clara and Rose." "No thanks necessary," Thomas replied. "They're my family now, protecting them, loving them. It's not a burden. It's a privilege." Ruth turned to Thomas with tears flowing freely now. "We were so wrong," she said. "So terribly wrong about everything. Clara wrote about you, about how you saved her and cared for her, but seeing you together, seeing how happy she is..." Ruth's voice broke. "I was so afraid she was ruined, that no good man would ever want her. I was wrong about that too." "We weren't wrong to be afraid," Thomas said gently. "You were wrong to give up hope. Clara's the strongest person I've ever known. What happened to her was terrible, but it didn't break her. It just showed her how much strength she really had." Over the next 3 days, Clara watched her parents fall in love with the life she'd built, They marveled at the vegetable garden, praised Thomas's management of the ranch, and spent hours playing with Rose, making up for lost time with their first grandchild. Ruth helped Clara preserve the summer vegetables, working beside her daughter with the easy rhythm they'd once shared, while Henry and Thomas discussed cattle and crops and the practical business of making a living from the land. On their last evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson, Ruth spoke quietly to Clara while the men discussed plans for expanding the herd. "I need you to know something," Ruth said. "When we heard about the trial, about what those men tried to do to you, your father and I both realized how completely we'd failed you. We should have stood by you, should have fought for you, should have protected you from Jimmy Morrison and everyone else who tried to hurt you." Clara rocked gently in the chair Thomas had made for her, Rose sleeping peacefully in her arms. "You were frightened," she said. "People do terrible things when they're frightened." "That's no excuse," Ruth replied firmly. "You were our daughter, our responsibility. We should have loved you better." Clara looked at her mother's profile in the fading light, seeing for the first time the woman beneath the bitter facade, someone who had lost children, struggled with poverty, faced disappointments that had gradually worn away her ability to hope. Understanding didn't erase the pain Ruth's rejection had caused, but it made forgiveness possible. "You're loving me better now," Clara said quietly. "That's what matters." Ruth turned to look at her daughter, at the baby sleeping peacefully in her arms, at the life Clara had built despite every obstacle placed in her path. "You're remarkable," she said. "I don't know how you found the strength to survive everything that happened to you, to build this beautiful life from such terrible beginnings." Clara smiled, looking out at the land that had become home, at Thomas discussing ranch business with her father as if they'd known each other for years, at Rose stirring slightly in her arms with the satisfied sleep of a child who knew she was utterly safe. "I had help," Clara said simply. "From Thomas, from people in town who chose to see the truth instead of the gossip from Rose herself. She gave me a reason to be strong. And from yourself," Ruth added. "Don't forget that. Your strength came from inside you, Clara. Everything else was just opportunity." As her parents prepared to return to Nebraska the next morning, Clara stood in her kitchen making breakfast and reflecting on how different this parting felt from the last time she'd seen them. There were no harsh words, no judgments, no sense of finality. Instead, there were promises to write regularly, plans for future visits, and the easy affection that came from relationships mended through understanding and grace. Henry loaded their bags into the wagon while Ruth held Rose one last time, whispering promises to her granddaughter about the doll she would send for Christmas and the stories she would tell when they met again. "Take care of yourself," Ruth said to Clara, embracing her with the warmth that had been missing for so many years. "Take care of your beautiful family." "I will, Mama." "And Clara." Ruth hesitated, then continued. "I'm proud of you, proud of the woman you've become, proud of the mother you are, proud of the life you've chosen." "I should have said that years ago." Clara felt tears threatening again, but they were good tears, healing tears. "Thank you, Mama. That means everything to me." As the wagon disappeared down the lane, Clara and Thomas stood on their porch with Rose between them, watching Clara's parents return to their old life while she remained rooted in her new one. The symbolism wasn't lost on either of them. Clara had come full circle, not by returning to what she'd fled, but by creating something entirely new and infinitely better. "Happy?" Thomas asked, slipping his arm around Clara's waist. Clara leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence, listening to Rose's contented babbling as she played with her wooden blocks. Around them, the ranch hummed with the quiet activity of a working operation, cattle lowing in the distance, horses moving in the pasture, the sound of the windmill turning lazily in the morning breeze. "Happy," Clara confirmed, meaning it completely. She thought about the girl who had boarded that train in December 1923, desperate and alone and convinced that her life was over. That girl could never have imagined this moment, standing on her own porch with her husband and daughter, watching her reconciled parents drive away from the home she'd built, through love and determination and sheer refusal to let cruelty have the final word. The train that was supposed to carry Clara to a different kind of life had instead delivered her to this one, not through the safe arrival she'd planned, but through the violent disruption that had thrown her, broken and bleeding, into Thomas's path. Sometimes mercy came wrapped in trauma, grace disguised as catastrophe, love emerging from the wreckage of everything that came before. Rose chose that moment to take her first independent steps, wobbling across the porch from her toys toward Clara with the determined concentration of the very young. Clara knelt to catch her daughter in her arms, laughing with pure joy at this milestone, this evidence of growth and progress and new achievements built on the foundation of security and love. "Did you see that?" Clara called to Thomas. "She walked. She actually walked." Thomas swept both of them into his arms, spinning them gently while Rose shrieked with laughter. "She's going to be running by winter," he predicted, "getting into everything, keeping us on our toes." "Good," Clara said firmly. "Let her run. Let her explore. Let her grow up knowing the world is full of possibilities instead of dangers." As the sun climbed higher into the August sky, Clara and Thomas carried Rose inside to begin another ordinary day in the extraordinary life they'd built together. There would be meals to prepare, chores to complete, cattle to tend, a garden to maintain. Simple tasks, but each one part of the larger project of creating a home where love could take root and flourish. Behind them, the Kansas prairies stretched, endlessly toward horizons that no longer seemed like barriers, but like invitations. Somewhere out there, trains still carried passengers toward uncertain futures. But Clara Brennan was exactly where she belonged, rooted, growing, blooming in soil that had been watered with tears, but nurtured by hope. The broken girl, who had been thrown from a moving train, was gone, replaced by a woman who knew her own strength, claimed her own worth, and had learned that sometimes the most beautiful flowers grew from the roughest ground. Love had taken root, and nothing, not fear, not shame, not the cruelty of those who would silence truth, could destroy what grew from such deep and carefully tended foundations. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.